As a young journalism major, I was struck by Diane's compassion, her thought-provoking questions, and the interesting people she engages with. I'm Esther Chamakili, host reporter at WAMU in Washington, D.C. I chose a career in public media because of Diane Rehm. So I'd like to invite you to join me and support this podcast. Just visit dianerehm.org/donate to make your gift. And thank you.
Hi, it's Diane. On my mind, how close is the United States to civil war? A few years ago, this question would have been laughed off. But after the events of January 6th, the idea of widespread political violence in the U.S. has become much more imaginable. In fact, nearly half of American adults think another civil war is not only possible, but likely. Canadian journalist Stephen Marche considers this question in a new book, The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future. He calls it a work of speculative nonfiction, exploring scenarios that expose the kind of friction that could unleash wider chaos. Now, he joins me to talk about why he thinks imagining an American Civil War is not only useful, but necessary. Stephen, I must tell you, the title of your book scared me from the beginning. Talk about why you have taken on this subject.
In 2016, I was sent by a Canadian magazine to cover the first Trump inauguration. And that day had a very kind of decline and fall of the Roman Empire feel. Like there was, I was standing on top of a limousine at one point, and then somebody lights the limousine on fire. And then at another point, I'm, with a group of people, and I decide to go out for a cigarette, and then I come back, everyone's been arrested. And there was just a lot of chaos on the street and violence on the street, and it was hard to see a good end. And then after that, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to devote the next 5 years to sort of figuring out where America's heading and what's causing it to head there, because I keep being shocked by what I see in the news. And unfortunately, this book is the conclusion that I came to.
So tell me how you've written this book. The subtitle is Dispatches from the American Future.
Well, I took, as a model, The Day After, which was in the 80s was turned into a massive made-for-TV movie that was a hugely successful TV movie. But it was originally written as a piece of fiction for Congress. And what it did was it described in fiction what a nuclear attack on Lawrence, Kansas would look like. And it used the sort of best available science to describe exactly what the fallout would be. And so my idea was basically to do the same with the American political system as it currently stands, and to show, to imagine what a civil war would look like, which you don't really have to imagine much. Like, you just slight projections of what happened as a way of showing the research. I interviewed about 200 people for this book, and I crossed America multiple times, and I talked to leading experts in all manner of fields. And so to get that information into the book, it was sort of the fiction is kind of a way of putting flesh on the bones, if you see what I mean.
So give me an idea of what leads you to imagine that there could, and maybe more than imagine, that there could be a next civil war in this country.
Well, I mean, the United States is a textbook case of a country headed for civil war. It has extremely high levels of hyperpartisanship that are toxic. I mean, that are now at points where they transcend even racial categories. Like, people don't want their children to marry Democrats if they're Republicans, or Republicans if they're Democrats. They don't give work to people from other parties. Like, if you're a Democrat, you hire other Democrats. If you're a Republican, you hire other Republicans. So there's that incredibly toxic level of hyperpartisanship. Then there's, enormous levels of inequality. Like, really incredibly high levels of income inequality, both horizontal and vertical inequality that have this feed into civil war. And then I think most importantly, there's just a sense of lack of legitimacy in the political institutions. Recently, only 20% of Americans said they thought the electoral system was fair. And so when you have that sort of in-between space between being a full-fledged democracy and being an autocracy, that's when things get really dangerous in other countries. That historically, that tends to be the moment of real crisis. And I think America is, if it's not already there yet, it is certainly on the way there.
So you saw Donald Trump leading us into an autocracy.
Well, I would say that to me, Donald Trump is not particularly relevant. To the argument in this book that I make that's hardest for most people to accept is, I say if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016, everything in the book would be exactly the same. Because, what we're dealing with here are really structural problems. So, by 2040, 50% of the country will control 85% of the Senate. You're already in a place where 5 Supreme Court justices were selected by presidents that did not win the popular vote. And you have a constitution that is really, there's no real solid legal agreement on what it means. It's really kind of meaningless outside of the political context of whoever is interpreting it. And so when you have the erosion of those kind of transnational institutions, the only one left in the United States that has the respect of everyone is the military. And that in itself is a really terrifying fact, because the military is not equipped or capable of, and it certainly doesn't want to have this, this position as the sole arbiter of trust of the American people. So, it's very easy to sort of get caught up in the horse race politics of things in America, like what Marjorie Taylor Greene said this week, or, what Ted Cruz did. But to me, that stuff is much less relevant than the sort of deeper structural issues that are eroding the sense of legitimacy in the institutions.
You talk about metrics to determine whether a country is leading up to a civil war. Talk about some of those.
I would put the odds of a civil war happening in the United States at about 67%, but there's no magic bullet here. There's no magic formula for what this is. That's a number that's taken from a meta-analysis by a large coterie of foreign policy experts and Civil War experts, and it's also the number that when you poll Americans, that's the number they tend to give when you average it out of how close they think they are to civil war. So that's where I get the metric. But the thing is that this process is what they call a complex cascading system. So it's how things feed into each other. Like it's not one thing. It's how multiple things feed into each other, including climate change, the inequality, they all feed into each other. And that's why the unexpected keeps happening, right? Like why we're constantly shocked by the news. Like why, even me writing this when January 6th happened, I wasn't surprised, but it was like, right, this is shocking. Or tanks on the streets of Washington on the 4th of July in 2020. The reason the unpredictable keeps happening is because the system is so full of turbulence that the slightest thing can set it off. It's like very dry tinder that a single spark can set off into a flame. So there are good models and there are bad models and there are sort of stronger models and weaker models. But ultimately what matters is how all these different processes feed into each other.
You also talk about domestic anti-government extremists and how they kill people, and that number continues to rise.
Right. I think that's the most direct threat. And, I do take a great deal of encouragement that the Department of Justice has set up a domestic terrorism unit. That's a very, very serious struggle. I think that's a generational struggle for law enforcement to get white power movements out of their police forces, out of the military. I have a lot of faith in the FBI. I think they can do it, but it's going to be like getting the mafia out of police departments. It's going to take a lot of work. Yeah, those militia groups are very serious. When the Oath Keepers list was released, it had shown very clearly that they'd infiltrated school jurisdictions, they'd infiltrated police departments, they'd certainly infiltrated the Republican Party. And so they are very large, and very serious, and they have explicit political aims, and they're also incredibly well armed. So I think they are to be taken with maximum seriousness.
Talk about the first scenario you lay out in the book where a sheriff comes to a bridge that's being blocked because it has to be repaired, and he doesn't like that.
Again, I built these fictional scenarios,
Yes.
but they're very much based on what's glaringly obvious right in front of me. So, one thing is that, the infrastructure in the United States is both the most glorious infrastructure in the world. It is a hugely expansive network, and it's also incredibly poorly maintained. It's all rotting and falling apart and quite dangerous, as we saw in Pennsylvania quite recently. So I imagined a bridge that is in need of repair, which requires the EPA and requires a whole federal bureaucracy to deal with. And then that, of course, is very frustrating to ordinary people. And then all it takes is you have a sheriff. There are many constitutional sheriffs. There's a whole organization of them who believe, I would say, without really any basis, certainly in the Supreme Court's opinion, that their role in government is interposition. That is to say, they exist to resist federal authority. And that, of course, has a whole romance attached to it, and it has the role of the sheriff has a very specific kind of fantasy life to it, and then that just becomes a hook on which all of these disparate movements from the hard right would gather, as we saw in Charlottesville, as we saw on January 6th. So again, I'm imagining a bridge and a sheriff and the militias gathering, but on the other hand, I don't have to imagine any of those things because they all exist. And that situation where you have a sheriff in resistance would create a very, very thorny bureaucratic and legal scenario for the U.S. military. And that's really the question of that chapter is I talked with military people about, what they call full spectrum operations in the homeland. That is to say, military engagement against insurrectionists in your own country. And tactically, in terms of who would win, no one is beating the U.S. Marines. The U.S. Marines are just going to walk over any militia people. But on the other hand, the legal and bureaucratic quagmire that would ensue would be a nightmare and would be extremely difficult for any general or any military or political leader to negotiate.
Has any of this that you imagine actually happened yet?
Well, I did have to throw out chapters because they kept happening, right? I imagined something like January 6th, and then January 6th happened. There are sheriffs who resist the federal authority, who have done exactly this on a bridge. I talked to them. Everything in this book is footnoted with I spoke to a guy who did it, right? So it all happened. Or has been modeled to happen so well that it's almost certainly going to happen. So I imagine the scenarios, but they're all based on real things.
So you have a congressional committee investigating January 6th, arresting, bringing forward a number of people involved. Doesn't the very presence of that Congress and its investigating authority taking a look at what happened on January 6th mitigate the notion that this is going to happen all over the country?
Well, with all due respect to that committee, who I have a lot of respect for, and I think they're doing super important work to clarify what happened, and I think that's extremely important. That report is going to enter into a narrative network, an informational network that's going to distort it right away. In fact, you can see it already. Within 12 hours after the insurrection, it was already being compared to Concord on far-right media. My country's nearly ended twice in my lifetime. I'm a Canadian. My country's almost ended twice in my lifetime because of Quebec separatism. And before I was born, martial law was imposed in 1970. So, all civil liberties were suspended because of terrorism, right? So these things happen to all countries. The question is, how do you react? And I think if you look at the reaction to January 6th, it's even more troubling than January 6th itself. Because, when I saw that scene where the guard who died, they were trying to do a moment of silence for this guard who died, and only one party and a few members of the other party showed up. I mean, this is a man who died trying to protect your physical security, and you're not going to honor him. I mean, so the report. I guess my answer to your question is the reaction to January 6th and the report and the reaction to the report, the inevitable reaction to the report, are actually more troubling. Right, like they're actually more of a sign of how this is spiraling out of control, because it's not like that event, January 6th, does not have a national meaning. It only has a meaning for Democrats and a separate meaning for Republicans. And the civil war that I'm envisioning in this book is not, North versus South, gray versus blue, Johnny Rebel, et cetera. It is a struggle over the meaning of America. And I think that January 6th, the reaction to that has shown that meaning is totally fragmented.
Tell me what you mean by the meaning of America.
Well, one of the most fascinating things about doing this book is, I'm going to talk to Texas separatists and people from, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, radical left-wing people. And I'm going to talk to Nazis and accelerationists and militiamen of various kinds. And almost without exception, they all worship the U.S. Constitution. Everyone on all sides. And I found that fascinating because, if you go and ask a Quebec separatists do not care about the Canadian Constitution. They want to overthrow it. They don't want to, they're not intent on, that's the whole point, is they don't want to be part of the British North America Act anymore. But both sides feel that they possess the meaning of America, right? And that comes down to very, very fundamental concepts like the notion of freedom, which, when I go to and talk with militia people or far-right people, their notion of freedom to me is impossible. They consider property taxes a form of enslavement. So, if that's your definition of freedom, I don't know how anyone could ever be free, except, I don't know, in some place where there's no other people. So, what I'm talking about is those very fundamental concepts are really what's at play. Freedom, America, what they mean, and who belongs. And, ultimately, whether America is a liberal multicultural democracy or is a white settler republic. That's another way of framing that question of meaning.
Is the difficulty of understanding and amending the Constitution, our Constitution, part of the problem itself? Didn't one of the founding fathers say the Constitution should be amended every 17 years?
I think it was Jefferson, and I think it was 19 years. I think he said every 19 years it needs to be rewritten, he said. And he said it needs to be rewritten because otherwise you have a contract with the dead. And I think when I look at the Constitution, what I see, first of all, obviously a work of great genius, great political genius, but a work of great political genius from a different century, right? From the 18th century. And I think especially when you look at the various interpretations of the Constitution, they're increasingly meaningless outside of a very arcane and very politically motivated mode of interpretation. And that really becomes a huge, that means that you're essentially not reflecting the will of the people anymore. Obviously, I understand why people do worship the American Constitution. It is a beautiful document of extreme power. But on the other hand, it is really, really dated. And, it really hasn't been updated since, it was 92 was the last time, but that was a very small amendment too. So it's been well over 19 years. And I think it does constitute a contract with the dead now.
Now a quick break. When we return, the rest of my conversation with Stephen Marche. Hi, it's Diane. For the March meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club, I'll host a conversation with author Amy Bloom about her new book, In Love, a memoir of love and loss. It's Friday, March 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Find out more and register at dianerehm.org/book club. And we're back. Here's the rest of my conversation with Stephen Marche, author of The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future. The number of people on the extreme right who could perhaps bring about this, or maybe it's people on the extreme left. I mean, how do you see a civil war actually breaking out? Do you see the militias on the extreme right moving Texas out of the Union? Does that trigger something that happens throughout the country? Or does Texas merely move out of the United States?
This is a bit heartbreaking to say, but I actually think that at this point in history, secession is one of the better options for the United States, like a peaceful secession of Texas and California and the red and blue America dividing. I mean, that to me is a peaceful, like when marriages get to the point that America's in, they sit the kids down and say, it's time for the chat. Like, it's time for us to talk about getting towards some reasonable solution where, this doesn't end in violence, right? But, I mean, like if you're asking me how like a large scale violence breaks out, I mean, I think what tends to happen is that there's all this buildup, institutions don't function, people feel the country is sliding away from them, the sense of legitimacy of the institutions is total, there's this complete bifurcation. Then you tend to have an act of spectacular violence, and then the military has to clamp down on it to prevent the violence. And of course, as America has learned from 70 years of counterinsurgency, there is no way to win at counterinsurgency. If you win, you still lose. And if you lose, you really lose. So what tends to happen is the attempt to clamp down on violence tends to spread it. And so, I think if there were a spectacular act of political violence, an act of massive terrorism, I mean, I imagine one in Dispatch 4 of the book, that could absolutely be what sparks a large-scale normalization of political violence. But, I mean, what we're talking about here is the rise of chaos and political violence becoming normalized generally.
The question you pose also in the book is, what if a lone gunman walks into a store where the President of the United States has decided to make an unscheduled stop, and everybody surrounds him as soon as they see him, he is shot and killed? Do you actually imagine that could happen now with the amount of Secret Service surrounding? Because we have seen this. We have seen it with Ronald Reagan. We saw it with John F. Kennedy. We saw it with Abraham Lincoln. Do you imagine that's one of the scenarios that could happen?
Well, I mean, one Secret Service agent told me, he said, assassination in America is a dimension of the political process, right? I mean, assassination in America is common. A little less than 1 out of 11 American presidents have been assassinated, and there have been a huge number of attempts. In Canadian history, there's been 2 attempts. In British history, 1 prime minister has been assassinated in their entire history, right? And that has to do with the very specific nature of the American president as an icon of a true representative of the country and so on. But you're right, the Secret Service are incredibly good at their jobs. They spend $1 million a day keeping the president alive. And I think it is very unlikely that somebody, like some terrorist organization planning it or is ever going to get even close to it. But there's a lot of violence in America. There's a lot of weapons. And assassins in history, they tend to have to get lucky to shoot someone. So, when you have as much hate as there is in America and as much weaponry as there is in America, I mean, the Secret Service cannot keep track of every violent person in the United States, right? Who wants to kill the president? That's a huge number of people at any given moment. So I don't think it's hard to imagine at all an assassination. Now, the thing is, America survived all the other assassinations before, right? Like an assassination in itself is not a political crisis because America's dealt with them many, many times. But in all the previous incidents, including Reagan, the Reagan attempt, and including JFK, both sides regarded it as a national tragedy. And I think also from what I was able to glean, they genuinely did. It wasn't just play acting. They were genuinely upset. Democrats were genuinely upset that Ronald Reagan had got a bullet. Republicans were genuinely upset that John F. Kennedy had been killed. From my research, it doesn't seem to me now that if Joe Biden, God forbid, or Donald Trump, God forbid, had been assassinated in office, that there would be collective mourning. Like there would be half of the country would mourn and half of the country would at least tolerate, right? And so that's really the question. Again, every country has assassinations and it has this violence. The question is, do you have the institutions, the national institutions that are solid enough and representative of the country as a whole enough to navigate your way out of them, to deal with them? And I'm afraid I don't think America does have those transnational institutions.
You do not believe we do at this moment?
Well, no. I mean, as I say, if they can't even mourn a security guard who died protecting them, like if they can't get together enough to do a moment of silence for somebody who died protecting their lives, their personal, individual, physical lives, how are they going to get together for, some president who they've spent, both sides now utterly demonize whoever is in power on the other side. That is American politics works by loathing. It is negative partisanship is the name of the game. So when you have those conditions, I think it's highly unlikely that there would be collective mourning.
How many people do you believe would be likely to engage in some kind of civil war? You've got extremists on both sides, but really, isn't that the minority of the total population? And wouldn't that be put down pretty quickly?
In terms of active militia people, like active people who are planning for a civil war, I mean, it's sizable, but it's certainly not it's not anywhere close to a majority. I mean, it's a tiny little fragment of the country as a whole. I try to be really precise about this stuff. So there's numbers in the book about how many sovereign citizens there are and how many oath keepers there are. But there are a lot of fragmentary movements on the sides, and there are violent members of the left, but they're much smaller and they're much less armed, and frankly, they're much more disorganized. So they're much less effective than right wing, people who believe in political violence on the right wing. But that really doesn't matter what size they are, because what happens in these conflicts is that these extremists take action, they provoke violent action, and then it consumes everyone. Like if you were to ask before Iraq, like how many people really want political violence in Iraq, the number would be negligible. But when it starts to take off, it consumes people. They call it complementary radicalization. That like when you see people on the extremes of the other party, you yourself become more extreme, and it tends to build on itself, and it creates a self-perpetuating loop that's really hard to escape, and is, frankly, the worst thing that can happen to a country. It's much worse than foreign occupation. When you're struggling over meaning, as we were talking about, what won't you do, right? And so, the size of these movements there's no question they're quite small, although way more sizable than they ever were at any other period in American history since Reconstruction, like vastly, tens and tens of times larger than the Weathermen or any group in the 60s. And actively planning. But yeah, there only a tiny fraction of Americans actually want violence. However, a recent poll said 33% thought that sometimes violence against your own government was necessary. And then you also have general things like when the governor of Kentucky says that blood is going to have to be spilled if Hillary Clinton is elected, and you have real political leaders discussing violence pretty openly. That bleeds into this whole thing too. I mean, they're speaking to wide audiences. They're not speaking to militia members in rural communities. They're speaking to relatively sizable groups, blocks of voters.
So at the beginning of this conversation, you said that Donald Trump was really not even very much part of your book. Donald Trump said, it was all going on long before me. Did he allow, by his very presence and the vocabulary he used, allow that force that was in the background, legitimacy. Did he allow that to come to the forefront with force?
Well, yeah, I would even go farther than that. I mean, with these pardoning remarks, like with these remarks he made about how he's going to pardon the people in January 6th, this is classic pre-Civil War behavior. I mean, this is the kind of thing you see in South America and you see in poor countries in everywhere else in the world, where you have the law dispelled in favor of your supporters, right? And under the force of a cult of personality. But I would say that Trump certainly permitted a lot of things, and he gave permission for a lot of violence. There are lots of people to blame, right? And certainly Trump is one of those people to blame. But on the other hand, I think if the question is really not who is to blame, because there's plenty, like Josh Hawley raising his fist to the people on January 6th who then go and sack his own institution. That's also somebody to blame. The state representative in Oregon who opened the door to rioters who then defiled his own legislature, like he's also to blame. So I'm not saying there's nobody to blame. I'm saying that before the blame is done, we have to look at what are the real causes of this. And the real causes of this are structural. They have to do with deep political rot in institutions. And if you want a solution, that's where the solution lies. It doesn't lie in, making sure Trump doesn't get elected in 2024. It has to do with dealing with real problems. Like the Senate by 2040, the Senate is going to be an anti-democratic body, right? Like it will simply not be an institution that reflects the will of the American people in any meaningful sense. That's a crisis. That's a crisis whether Donald Trump is alive or not.
So does congressional power matter anymore?
I mean, of course it matters. This is an amazing power that exists in Congress and the presidency. But, when you look at what Joe Biden had to do to win in 2020, and that he got the Senate and he got the House, and he could not get diplomats in office for almost a year. They still flirt with reneging on their debt. Basic functions of government are not being fulfilled, right? Increasingly, what you're seeing is America entering a post-policy period where the country is literally ungovernable. It's not being governed. And so, that means that the structure matters less than who is in Congress. It matters that, what are the actual powers that Congress can do anymore. And so that's where the crisis rests, right? So, not to say that these elections don't matter or elections don't have consequences, because of course they do. But on the other hand, the problems are much deeper than who's going to win the next election.
So, Stephen, do you see any danger in putting out a book like this, in talking about this as though all of the foundations are there for this to happen? Doesn't the case build on itself? Are you at all worried about that?
I think the other way is dangerous. I mean, I think pretending that things are just going to work out is really dangerous. I think thinking that, the American political system is going to right itself and it's all going to be okay, that's what the real danger is. Several reviewers have said that. Major reviewers have said, putting out a book like that is very dangerous, which in a way is, in a perverse way, flattering to me. Like I have this power to shape the future of the republic, which I do not feel that any book, certainly I don't have. But I would say that, the point of this book is a wake-up call. My effort in this book was nothing more than clarity. That's what I wanted to do. The danger to me is not looking, right? Is not seeing what's right in front of your face. One of the things that I think was very frightening to me is how the first Civil War happened without really anyone expecting it. No one predicted it. No one thought it was coming. In hindsight, in historical hindsight, of course, it's very clear. You can see these trends. You can see, the nullification crisis. You can see bloody Kansas. You can see, the state territories opening up. And every time a new territory opens up, they have to answer the question, are we a slave country or are we a free country? But at the time, they stumbled into it. The North had to go to Europe to buy guns, right? They did not have enough weapons to fight a war because they didn't think they were going to fight one. So, to me, I've written this book with as much clarity as I can muster, as simply as I can muster, putting the best facts that I can gather without exaggerating, because there's no need to exaggerate, just being, here are the facts, look at them. I have to believe that has to be the right thing to do.
So you believe that this is inevitable?
No, certainly not. The odds are 67%. Even if nothing is solved, there's no necessary reason this needs to happen. I just think that's what the odds are, which is scary enough, right? I mean, we don't need to exaggerate at all. The other thing is, America is the great country of political reinvention. It does possess a revolutionary spirit that is incredibly powerful, and in which I actually, as an outsider, have a great deal of faith in. And I do believe that if any country can get its, talk its way out of this, can figure a way to get back to a real practical politics where, your government is serving people rather than these, antiquated ideas from the 18th century, it would be America. But, I guess the hope I don't have is that it's all just going to work out. That it's all just going to, it's going to be the 60s and there was all the burning and the 140 cities burned after MLK was assassinated. And then it's the 70s and it's all lava lamps and quaaludes and whatever else was going on in the 70s. That's not going to happen. What is going to happen is a confrontation with these institutional crises is at hand. And it's going to need to be dealt with.
Do you see any one process that could change your entire scenario?
Well, I mean, it's a complex cascading system. So it's one of those things where you don't know. That's why one of the things about doing these precise models and really going for the best available models is you realize how basically unpredictable the world is, right? I mean, if a big hurricane hit New York, which is absolutely possible and, is increasingly likely, and the people who say that are not activists, they're like reinsurers who believe, people that insurance companies make $1 trillion bets on their science, that would be really devastating. One model showed that there were going to be 13 million climate refugees in America by 2015. So that's a lot of anarchy. That's a lot of anarchy to pump through the system of a country. That could really, really damage it. As for things that could really alter the political situation, the talk of secession has been getting much louder. It's much more popular than it ever was. It's 58% of Republicans now support some kind of secession, and it's 41% of California Democrats are thinking about it. Those are big numbers, and you have Ted Cruz talking about it, and other Republicans talking about it. Obviously that would completely change the dynamic. That seems to me at this point a very sensible approach. More basic things are the government's focus on domestic terrorism. I personally put a lot of hope in that. I think they're good, and they will clamp down on violence, and they'll probably do it in an effective way. And doing it now before it gets out of hand is a really good sign. So this is a struggle that has been joined. This is, nothing is decided. There's nothing inevitable. But you do need to realize, you have a real domestic terrorism problem. You need to deal with it immediately, right, before it gets really out of hand. And you have structural governmental problems that, you need to address collectively. How that would happen seems to me very difficult to say. But, those are the things that would really change this in a positive way.
Stephen Marche, thank you for being with us. I won't say it was a pleasure to talk with you, except to say that you make really very interesting points and lots to think about. So thank you very much.
Well, I can unabashedly say it was a complete pleasure to speak with you. So thank you very much for having me.
That was journalist Stephen Marche, author of The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future. And that's all for today. We welcome your feedback and suggestions. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or send us an email, drpodcast@wamu.org. Our theme music is composed by Jim Brunberg and Ben Landsberg of Wonderly. The show is produced by Allison Brody. Our engineer today is Adrian Danhauser. Thanks for listening all. Be well, stay safe. I'm Diane Rehm.